a young widow and mother of two, stood in the charred ruins of her apartment in Queens, holding a photograph of her children in borrowed clothes. Everything else was ash. Aria Morgan had exactly $78 to her name. The fire had taken her job, her home, her security, and nearly taken her hope. But worse was coming. Her landlord, Douglas Hale, a brutal man of 63 with connections to dirty cops, had issued an ultimatum written in cold legal language. $47,000 in damages within 12 days, or he would have her arrested for arson. He had caused the fire himself through negligence, but his connections ran deep, and her word meant nothing against his. Meanwhile, his business partner Margaret Harrington, a wealthy woman of 58 with calculated cruelty in her eyes, spread rumors through the neighborhood like poison gas. Aria was an unfit mother, Margaret whispered in grocery stores and laundromats. No one should hire her. No one should help her. Aria was trapped, suffocating under the weight of forces far more powerful than she could fight. She was alone. She was invisible. She was running out of time. But in that moment, Aria did not know what was about to change her life. On a clear winter night, frost coating the windows of an upscale Italian restaurant in Manhattan like diamonds catching starlight, Aria Morgan carried a silver tray through the dining room. She wore a black and white maid uniform, crisp and simple, purchased with $5 from a thrift store. The air around her smelled of garlic, rosemary, and expensive cigars burning in crystal ashtrays. Candlelight reflected off polished mahogany surfaces. The restaurant was called Salvatore's, and it was owned by a man whose name meant nothing to her. A man named Luca Caruso. Luca Caruso was 42 years old. He sat in a private booth in the back corner, away from other diners, the way he always Saturday. His suit was charcoal gray, tailored so precisely it looked like it had been painted onto his body. A silver ring sat heavy on his right hand, and a scar ran along his jawline like a question mark asking what he had survived. His daughter Emma sat across from him, 6 years old, in a velvet dress the color of wine, her dark hair braided with ribbon. She was laughing at something he had said. This was rare. Luca Caruso did not laugh often. Aria approached the booth, her steps quiet and measured. The wine bottle sat on her tray, its label written in Italian, its price more than she spent on food in a week. She had learned not to think about such things. She was reaching to pour when Emma shifted forward suddenly, her small hand moving too fast. The olive on the child's plate disappeared into her mouth. For one perfect second, nothing happened. Then Emma's face changed color. Not slowly. All at once. Her mouth opened but no sound came out. Her small hands flew to her throat. Her eyes went wide. The blood drained from her cheeks, leaving her the color of old paper. Luca's powerful body went absolutely still. His hands, which had commanded empires and broken men, were suddenly useless. He reached for his daughter but hesitated, frozen between the need to act and the terror that any movement might make things worse. Aria dropped the wine bottle. It shattered against the floor with a sound like a gunshot in the silence. She did not think. She did not hesitate. She moved forward like water finding its path, pulling Emma from the booth, positioning her body behind the child's, wrapping her arms around the small ribcage. Her hands found the pressure point just below Emma's ribs. She knew where to press because she had read a library book 3 years ago about first aid, a book she had checked out because her own children had choked once on a grape and she had been terrified ever since. One thrust. Upward. Explosive. The olive shot from Emma's mouth like a bullet. The child gasped, coughed, gasped again. Breath returned. Color returned. Life returned. Aria smoothed the girl's dark hair, whispering words soft as prayer. You are okay now, sweetheart. You are okay. Breathe. Breathe with me. Emma's small hand reached back and gripped Aria's arm. Her fingers were shaking. The other diners had gone silent. Everyone in the restaurant had turned to look. But Aria did not notice them. She was already stepping back, already releasing the child, already lowering her head. She did not ask for gratitude. She did not meet the eyes of the man whose daughter she had saved. She simply returned to the kitchen, disappearing like a shadow that had never been fully real. What she did not know was that Luca Caruso operated according to a code older than law, deeper than conscience. In his world, debts were currency more valuable than money. Mercy was rarer than diamonds. And he did not forget either one. His daughter looked up at him, breathing steadily now, the fear already fading from her face the way fear fades in children. "Papa," she said. "The lady saved me." Luca nodded slowly. He was not looking at Emma. He was staring toward the kitchen doorway where Aria had vanished, his expression unreadable, his hand still extended in the air where his daughter had been. Across the restaurant, two men in dark suits exchanged a look. One was Tony, lean and scarred. The other was Theo, broad-shouldered and quiet. They had worked for Luca Caruso for 15 years combined. They had never seen him move the way he had moved in those seconds when his daughter could not breathe. They had never seen him afraid. And they had certainly never seen him let a stranger walk away without acknowledgement after saving his child's life. Something had shifted in that moment. Neither man could name it, but both of them felt it. The temperature of the room had changed. Before we continue, drop a like if this story hits you. Share it with someone who needs to hear it and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming tomorrow. Every subscription and every share helps us reach more people who need to hear that hope still exists in the darkest places. Now let us go back to the beginning. Let us go back to the fire. 3 days earlier, the apartment building on Jamaica Avenue in Queens was burning. It had started in the basement, in the electrical wiring that Douglas Hale had refused to repair despite the building inspector's written warning 6 months before. The warning was still in his filing cabinet, stamped urgent, dated March. It was now November. Hale had ignored it because fixing the wiring would have cost him $12,000, and Hale did not spend money he did not have to spend. The fire started at 2 in the morning. Aria Morgan was asleep in the smaller bedroom with her 2 children, 7-year-old Marcus and 5-year-old Claire. She woke to the smell of smoke. Not the gentle smoke of a candle or a fireplace, but acrid, choking smoke that burned her nostrils. Her eyes opened. The room was dark except for an orange glow creeping under the door. The smoke alarm was screaming. She moved without thinking. She pulled Marcus from his bed, grabbed Claire from hers, wrapped the older child's hand around her waist and carried the younger one on her hip. She ran toward the door, felt the heat before she opened it. The hallway was filled with orange and black. The stairs were not passable. She turned and ran toward the window. It was painted shut with 17 years of paint. She smashed it with the heel of her shoe, cut her hand on glass. She did not feel the pain. She lifted Marcus through the opening first. He cried, terrified, dangling from her arms as she tried to lower him to the fire escape. She heard the crash of the bedroom door as the fire found her room. Later, the firefighters would carry her out. She had severe burns on her right arm and across her shoulders. Marcus had a broken arm from the fall to the fire escape. Claire was unharmed but had smoke inhalation. They spent 10 days in Jamaica Hospital. The doctors said they were lucky. The word tasted like ash in Aria's mouth. When they were released, Aria had nowhere to go. The building was condemned. Everything she owned was ash. A woman from the church let her stay in a spare bedroom for the first week. Then her sister came to visit and said something about their own children, and Aria understood she had overstayed her welcome. A neighbor offered her room for 3 days. Then 4 days passed and Aria began to feel the shift in the air, the weight of obligation she could not repay. On the 9th day after the fire, she stood in the ruins of the apartment building wearing borrowed clothes. The photograph in her hand was the only thing that had survived. It was in a metal frame, protected by the ash around it. Her 2 children on her lap, all 3 of them smiling at a Walmart portrait studio on a day when things seemed like they might work out. That was 18 months ago. She had $78 in a plastic bag in her pocket. $78 and her hands and her willingness to work. That was all she had left. The next morning, the letter arrived. It was delivered by hand, placed in the mailbox of the church where she had slept that first night. It was on official letterhead, from an attorney representing Douglas Hale. The letter was brief and precise. Aria Morgan was responsible for damages to the apartment building resulting from the fire. The amount was $47,000. She had 12 days to pay or face arrest on charges of arson and criminal negligence. 12 days. $47,000. It was impossible. It was cruel. It was designed to be impossible. Aria sat on the church steps in the freezing November air, holding the letter in her hands. Her hands began to shake. Not from cold. From the understanding that she was being hunted by people far more powerful than herself, and she had nowhere to hide. The November wind tore through the streets of Queens like a blade wrapped in ice. It was 2 in the morning when Aria Morgan woke to the smell of burning plastic and the sound of her daughter screaming. Not a child's nightmare scream. The scream of genuine terror. She moved without thinking. Her body knew what to do before her mind caught up. She was already out of bed, already moving towards Sophie's room, when she saw the orange glow bleeding under the kitchen door. The hallway was filling with smoke so thick it swallowed the air she tried to breathe. It felt like inhaling needles. Michael was 8. He was old enough to be afraid and smart enough to understand what fire meant. He stood in the doorway of his bedroom, frozen, watching the kitchen wall disappear behind a curtain of flames that moved like something alive, something hungry. Aria grabbed him first, one arm around his waist, pulling him toward the stairs. Sophie was still screaming, a sound like breaking glass, and Aria's lungs were burning and her eyes were burning and the heat was so intense the paint on the walls was beginning to blister and peel like skin. She could not carry both of them. She could carry both of them. She had to. She grabbed Sophie with her other arm and ran for the stairs. The smoke was so thick now she could not see 3 feet in front of her face. Only the glow of the fire below, lighting the way down like a beacon to hell. Her bare feet slapped against cold wood. Michael was coughing, gasping, saying "Mommy, Mommy, Mommy" like a prayer that could not save him. Sophie's small body was rigid with terror against her chest. The acrid smell of burning electrical wiring filled everything. It coated her mouth, her throat, her lungs. Later she would learn that this smell, this specific chemical burn, was the smell of the faulty wiring in the walls that Douglas Hale had refused to fix for 8 months. It was the smell of negligence. The smell of a man who collected rent but did not believe he owed his tenants safety. The smell of cruelty. She reached the ground floor. The front door was 30 feet away, but the heat was pushing her backward like a physical force. She could feel the skin on her arms beginning to tighten from the temperature. Her nightgown was smoking at the edges. She did not stop. She ran straight through the lobby, and the cold air of the November night hit her like a slap when she burst through the doors. The street was already alive with people. Mrs. Chen from 3B, Mr. Rodriguez with his dog, teenagers from the corner store, all of them standing in the cold watching the building burn. Neighbors in bathrobes and pajamas. Sirens already wailing in the distance, getting closer, getting louder. Someone was screaming. Someone else was crying. Aria fell to her knees on the sidewalk and held her children so tightly she thought she might fuse with them, become one single thing that fire could never separate again. The firefighters arrived 6 minutes later. Aria would remember this number for the rest of her life. 6 minutes. In 6 minutes, the entire east wall of the building had been consumed. In 6 minutes, the second floor was engulfed. In 6 minutes, everything she owned in the world burned down to ash. Everything except one thing. The next morning, after the fire had cooled and the fire marshal had finished his preliminary investigation, Aria was allowed back into the building to search for salvageable belongings. There was nothing. The kitchen was a blackened skeleton. The living room furniture was char and springs. Her mattress was ash. The children's toys were melted plastic and memory. But on the nightstand in her bedroom, somehow protected by the metal frame and the ash that had fallen around it like a blanket, was the photograph. Aria and Michael and Sophie, three faces smiling at a Walmart portrait studio from 18 months earlier, on a day when she thought things might be turning around. When she thought the rent increase would not come. When she thought her children would not be traumatized by fire and loss before they reached 10 years old. She held the photograph to her chest and did not cry. She had learned a long time ago that crying was a luxury. Crying did not pay rent. Crying did not fill the bellies of hungry children. Crying did not stop the people who were hunting you. The shelter took them in that first night. Salvation Army, 3 cots in a room with 20 other people who had lost everything. The next night, a neighbor's cousin offered Aria her spare bedroom for 1 week. Aria accepted and was grateful and counted the days, knowing that after 7 days she would have to leave. On day 5, she overheard her host on the phone, "I don't have the space. She has 2 kids. I can't do this long term." Aria packed their bags without being asked and left 2 days early. Better to leave on her own terms than wait to be evicted. A woman from her church offered her a room for 3 days. Then the 3 days stretched to 4, and Aria began to feel the weight of it, not the physical weight of sleeping on an air mattress, but the weight of obligation she could never repay. The weight of being a burden. On the morning of the 9th day after the fire, Aria told the woman she had made other arrangements and left before breakfast. She had $78 in a plastic bag in her pocket. $78. 2 children. No apartment. No job. No references who would speak favorably of her now that the rumors had begun to spread. She did not know yet what Margaret Harrington was saying. She did not know that the woman was standing on neighborhood corners, speaking to people like Mrs. Chen, crafting a narrative that painted Aria not as a victim but as a criminal. A woman who left candles burning while her children slept. A woman unfit for motherhood. A woman whose carelessness had nearly killed 2 innocent children. It was the cruelty of it that would break her. Not the fire. Not the homelessness. Not the hunger or the cold or the loss. It was the systematic destruction of her character by people who had already destroyed her home. That afternoon, the letter arrived. It was placed in the mailbox of the church where she had spent the first night after the fire. Official letterhead. The attorney's name in bold at the top. Aria stood in the cold vestibule and opened it with hands that had already begun to understand what it would say. To Ms. Aria Morgan, this office represents Douglas Hale, owner of the property located at 447 Sycamore Street, Queens, New York. As the tenant of record, you are responsible for all damages resulting from the fire on November 14th. The preliminary assessment of structural damage, code violations, and loss of rental income totals $47,000. Payment is required within 12 days of this letter or criminal charges will be filed. $47,000. 12 days. She sat on the church steps with the letter in her hands and tried to do the mathematics of survival. $47,000 divided by 12 days meant she needed to earn nearly $4,000 per day. She worked minimum wage jobs that paid her $8.50 per hour. Even if she worked 24 hours straight, every day, without sleep or food, she could not earn enough. The mathematics were deliberately impossible. The letter was not a request. It was a death sentence written on official letterhead. What changed everything was that at that exact moment, as Aria was calculating the geometry of her own destruction, a man named Luca was sitting in his office on the top floor of a building he owned in Manhattan, reading emails on a laptop that cost more than Aria's entire monthly living expenses had been before the fire. He did not know her name yet. He did not know that in exactly 43 days, he would be sitting in a private booth at his restaurant when a woman with smoke still in her hair and terror still in her eyes would save his daughter's life. He did not know that this woman would change everything. But at that moment, on that November afternoon, Aria Morgan folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope and understood that she had 12 days to become someone she had never been before. Someone who did not follow rules. Someone who did not wait for permission. Someone who was willing to do whatever was necessary to keep her children fed. She stood up from the church steps, pulled her borrowed coat around her shoulders, and walked toward the nearest train station. Her bare feet were still burned from the fire. Every step sent pain up her legs. But she did not slow down. She was no longer invisible. She was becoming dangerous. The olive lodged in Emma's throat like a tiny stone of death. Her face turned the color of storm clouds, deep purple, desperate, and the silence that followed was the kind of silence that swallows rooms whole. Luca Caruso, a man who had ordered executions with less emotion than someone ordering coffee, stood frozen 3 feet away, hands outstretched toward his daughter but unable to move. Unable to act. Unable to save her. This was the moment that would change everything, though none of them knew it yet. But let us rewind to understand how a woman with $78 to her name and a prayer card in her pocket would walk into this restaurant and become the only person who could. Aria Morgan stood in the supply closet of Caruso's on her first morning, holding a mop that was older than her oldest memories. The closet smelled of bleach and something else, old wood, maybe, or time itself. Paolo, the restaurant manager, a thin man with suspicious eyes and a permanent frown, had handed her a black and white uniform 2 sizes too large and said only, 5 in the morning, closing at midnight. Keep your head down. Never speak to customers in the private section. You'll get $83 per day. Cash. You need this job, you follow the rules. Understand? She understood. The uniform hung on her frame like borrowed skin. Her hands, still raw from burns that had never fully healed, trembled as she tied the apron strings. The shelter had given her this uniform last week. Everything she owned now came from donations: the coat, the shoes with holes in the sole, the 2 dresses she rotated between shifts. Her children wore clothes from thrift stores. Sophie, her 7-year-old, had asked yesterday when they could go home. Aria had no answer. The apartment was ash. The landlord's deadline was 5 days away. The restaurant was a cathedral of marble and candlelight when the doors opened in the evening. Aria scrubbed floors on her knees, the cold tile pressing into bones that seemed to have forgotten softness. Her hair hung in her face, damp from steam and sweat. Around her, servers moved like dancers in a choreography she didn't understand, carrying plates of food that cost more than she spent on groceries in a month. She was invisible. Good. Invisible meant safe. Invisible meant no one asked questions about the scars on her wrists or why she flinched when anyone raised their voice. On her 4th night, she mopped the dining room at 2 in the morning, the restaurant finally empty except for voices coming from the private booth in the back. The sound traveled through the thin air, men talking in low tones about things that made her instinctively keep her eyes down. She heard fragments: territories, Vincent needs discipline, move the shipment Tuesday. She did not understand and did not want to. Understanding was dangerous. She kept mopping, her movements mechanical, her breathing shallow. Paolo appeared from nowhere, grabbed her arm. Never go near that booth when he's here. Understand? His grip hurt, but she said nothing. Yes, she whispered. Never. She had no idea that the man in that booth was Luca Caruso, that his name carried weight in certain neighborhoods that could destroy entire lives with a phone call. She only knew she needed this job. She needed the $83 per day because she needed $4,000 per day to save her children from Douglas Hale's rage. 2 weeks passed like 2 years. Aria worked, saved money in a jar beneath the bed at the shelter, counted it obsessively: $217 now, $340, $485. Not nearly enough. The deadline approached like a wall made of stone. Hale called the shelter again, left another message: time's running out, Miss Morgan. The courts are prepared to move on this. I suggest you prepare yourself for the consequences. It was the 9th of December when Paolo pulled her aside before the dinner shift. My server didn't come in. You're going to serve tonight. The private booth needs wine. Don't speak unless spoken to. Don't make eye contact. Don't exist. Understood? Aria's hands shook as she carried the wine bottle through the dining room. The restaurant was different in the evening, warmer somehow, though the temperature had dropped outside to 9 degrees. Frost coated the windows like crushed diamonds. The smell of basil and simmering sauce filled the air, rich enough to taste. She approached the private booth. Luca Caruso sat with his daughter Emma, who wore a dark blue velvet dress and had her dark hair braided with silver ribbons. Emma was talking, rapid-fire, animated, about her school play. She was 6 years old and entirely unself-conscious, completely comfortable in her father's attention. Aria watched Luca listen with a gentleness on his scarred face that made him look like someone else entirely. Not a powerful man. Just a father. She began to pour the wine. Emma reached for the bread basket, extracted an olive from the small dish, popped it into her mouth mid-sentence, and then Marco forgot his line and everyone laughed, but then nothing came out. No words. No breath. Emma's face went crimson. Her small hands flew to her throat. Her eyes went wide with the specific terror of a child who could not breathe, who did not understand why air had suddenly become inaccessible. Luca stood so fast his chair tipped backward with a crash that echoed through the restaurant. He reached for her, powerful man accustomed to commanding rooms, suddenly helpless in the way only a parent can be helpless. His voice cracked, "Emma! Emma, breathe!" Aria did not think. She dropped the wine, the bottle shattered, red spreading across white tablecloth like blood in a hospital, and ran to the child. No hesitation. No calculation. She positioned herself behind Emma, wrapped her arms around the small rib cage, found the spot just below the sternum, pulled inward and upward with controlled force. Once. Emma's body convulsed but nothing came out. Her face darkened further. Twice. The olive shot from her mouth, bounced across the floor, rolled to a stop against the white marble like a tiny stone of relief. Emma gasped, coughed, dragged in air with a sound like tearing paper. Aria held her until the coughing stopped, smoothed her hair, whispered, "You're safe now, sweetheart. You're okay. Breathe slowly." Emma clung to her. For 30 seconds, maybe less, Aria was the only solid thing in the world. She gently passed the child back to her father, stepped back immediately, already apologizing, "I'm so sorry about the wine, I'll clean it up, I'll pay for." Luca Caruso stood frozen, face white, hands still trembling. He stared at her like she was something holy. Behind him, Tony and Theo, who had materialized from the shadows like ghosts, had half-drawn guns, their bodies coiled with violence that had nowhere to go. The entire restaurant had gone silent. Even the kitchen sound seemed to pause. "What is your name?" Luca's voice was raw. "Aria Morgan, sir. You saved my daughter's life. Anyone would have. What do you want?" His eyes burned into hers. "Money? A job? A house? Name it." She shook her head, already backing toward the kitchen. "Nothing, sir. I'm just glad she's okay." And she disappeared before he could say another word. What she didn't know was that Luca Caruso spent the next hour holding his daughter, remembering the last time he felt this helpless, 17 years old, hiding in a closet, 3 gunshots in rapid succession, his father falling like a building being demolished. That was the night he decided that mercy was a luxury only the weak could afford. He built his empire on vengeance. He had destroyed men for lesser insults. And this woman, this maid in a cheap uniform that hung on her frame like borrowed skin, had asked for nothing. Shown mercy without transaction. That night, he told Tony, find out everything about her. Everything. The investigation took 3 days. By the time it was complete, Luca Caruso knew that Aria Morgan had 2 children in a shelter, that she worked minimum wage jobs, that she was being threatened by a landlord for $47,000 she did not have, that she had survived a fire in her apartment and had been blamed for it by a community that needed someone to blame. He knew she had a worn prayer card in her pocket that had belonged to her mother. He knew she did not eat on the days her children ate. And he knew that in 17 years of building this empire, no one had ever shown him mercy. Paolo dropped an envelope on the floor next to Aria while she was scrubbing baseboards, from the boss. He says thank you. Inside was $5,000 in cash. Aria stared at it, hands shaking. This was more money than she had seen in 2 years. This could buy her time, could feed her children for months, but it would not save her. The deadline was still 3 days away. 5,000 was not 47,000. 50,000 divided by 3 days meant the mathematics remained deliberately impossible. That evening, Luca himself appeared at the restaurant for the first time since the choking incident. He sat in his usual booth, alone. He gestured for Aria to bring his dinner. She approached terrified, set down the plate, osso buco, the smell of braised meat and red wine filling the air between them. "Sit," he said. "Sir, I can't, I'm working." "Sit." She sat, hands folded in her lap, eyes down. The silence stretched like taffy being pulled. Around them, the restaurant continued its dance, but she heard nothing except her own heartbeat and his breathing. Finally, he spoke. "Tony tells me Douglas Hale is threatening you. $47,000. Arson charges. A deadline of 2 days from now." Her head snapped up. "How do you? I make it my business to know." His voice was not unkind. "Why didn't you use the money I gave you? It's not enough. And I can't take charity, Mr. Caruso. I have to figure this out myself." "Why?" "Because if I don't, I'm just another person who needs saving. And I've been needing saving my whole life. I'm tired of being helpless." He studied her for a long moment. His scarred face in the candlelight looked ancient and young simultaneously. Finally, he nodded. "All right. But know that the offer stands. Always." She returned to work, wiping down tables, clearing plates, trying to ignore the feeling that something had shifted in the air. What she didn't know was that Luca had already made the first phone call. That by midnight, federal investigators would be reviewing records of Douglas Hale's 40-year crime spree. That Margaret Harrington's carefully constructed reputation was about to collapse under the weight of documented cruelty that Theo had recorded and meticulously catalogued. That everything was already in motion, a machine constructed specifically to protect someone who didn't know she was being protected. Vincent Caruso walked into the restaurant at 9 o'clock that night, 28 years old, expensive suit, entitled smirk, cocaine habit showing in the brightness of his eyes. He saw Aria clearing a table near the kitchen and something in his expression changed. Possession. Hunger. He turned to Paolo. "Who is that?" Paolo went pale. "Sir, I don't." "The girl. Who is she?" And in that moment, the threat that would bring everything to a head entered the building. The supply closet smelled like bleach and industrial soap, the shelves cramped with mops and bottles and rags that cost less than Vincent Caruso's watch. He blocked the doorway, 30 seconds of silence stretching like a blade wrapped in ice, his expensive suit wrinkled from cocaine and whiskey, his eyes too bright, too hungry. "So you're the saint everyone's talking about," he said, voice dripping with something that wasn't admiration. It was possession. It was threat. Aria reached for a cleaning cloth, trying to move past him. "Excuse me, I need to." His hand shot out and gripped her wrist. Not hard enough to bruise. Hard enough to trap. His fingers were cold. "My uncle doesn't give $5,000 to maids." "What did you really do for him?" She yanked her arm free, her voice trembling like a candle in the wind. "Let go of me. You think you're special." He leaned closer, cologne and whiskey and menace filling the small space. "You think he cares about you?" His voice turned ugly, predatory. "I know about your landlord problem. $47,000. Due tomorrow." He paused, watching her face change. Watching fear flood across her features like a curse that could not be erased. "What if I told Douglas Hale exactly where to find you? What if I told him you've been hiding money?" Aria's breath stopped. Vincent smiled, satisfied with the power he held in his palm. "That's what I thought. You want my uncle's protection? You go through me first." He stepped back, straightened his jacket, and walked out of the supply closet, leaving her standing in the dark among the cleaning chemicals and the smell of industrial failure. She stood there for 3 minutes, maybe 4. Her hands shook. Her legs felt like water. Everything she had fought for, everything she had survived, all of it was about to collapse on top of her head. At 2 in the morning, the subway platform under the city was empty except for frost coating the rails like shattered mirrors and one drunk man sleeping on a bench with his coat as a pillow. The platform was cold. November cold. The kind of cold that goes through clothing and skin and settles in the bone marrow. Aria stood at the yellow line, her breath coming in white clouds, her worn shoes planted on the concrete like she had grown roots. Her shift had ended at 1:30. She had wiped down every table. She had swept every corner. She had collected $42 in tips, which brought her total to exactly $78 to her name. $78 between her and complete annihilation. The prayer card sat in her pocket, soft from years of handling, its edges worn nearly transparent. St. Jude, patron of lost causes. Her mother had given it to her before she died, pressing it into Aria's palm with hands that already knew they were leaving. This is for when you have nowhere else to turn, her mother had whispered. Aria was 14. She had turned to it 10,000 times since. The deadline was 10 hours away. Her children were in a shelter 7 blocks from here, sleeping on thin mattresses, sharing a room with 3 other families. Sophie, 5 years old, had asked yesterday when they could go home. When Aria couldn't answer, the little girl had drawn her a picture, 5 of them sitting together at a table, all of them smiling, all of them safe. Sophie had colored the happy faces in purple crayon because, as she said, purple for happy days. Red for sad days. When you feel sad, look at this. Aria had kept that picture folded in her pocket for 17 days. She stepped closer to the platform edge and looked down at the rails. The metal gleamed under the fluorescent lights, cold and perfect and final. A train was coming, she could hear it in the tunnel, feel the vibration traveling up through her shoes and into her legs. The sound grew louder. The wind pushed through the tunnel mouth, carrying the smell of electricity and metal and something else, something like the end of things. One step. That was all it would take. One step forward and everything would stop. The fear would stop. The struggle would stop. Her children would go to foster care, but at least they would not watch her be arrested. At least they would not grow up visiting her in a prison visiting room with bulletproof glass between them. At least they would not know that their mother gave up. The train was close now. She could hear the screech of the brakes starting to engage. She could feel the displacement of air as it approached. She closed her eyes. And then she felt it. The prayer card beneath her fingers, still in her pocket. She remembered Sophie's voice from last night, small and certain, "Mama, you're the bravest person I know." One tiny thing. One small voice in the darkness. Aria stepped back from the platform edge as the train screamed into the station, metal on metal, the sound of something massive and unstoppable. Passengers shuffled on and off. She boarded it. Sat down. Rode it back to the shelter where her children slept. She held them in the darkness, one on each side, their small bodies warm against her, and she whispered, "I will not give up. Tomorrow I will figure this out. I promise." But what she did not know was that Luca Caruso had just received a phone call. Theo's voice came through, urgent and low. "Boss," Vincent approached the girl. Threatened her. Mentioned Hale, mentioned everything. The line went silent for 10 seconds. Just the sound of Luca's breathing, controlled, measured, and then something else underneath it, something cold and dangerous stirring in his chest like a predator waking. "Gather everyone," Luca said. "Now." Within the hour, 12 men in black tactical gear moved through the pre-dawn darkness like ghosts, like a perfectly programmed machine, like judgment descending without warning. Federal agents, some legitimately FBI, others on Luca's private payroll, all coordinated through calls he made to men who owed him debts greater than any amount of money could repay, surrounded Douglas Hale's estate in Long Island at 4:30 in the morning. Frost coated every surface. The grass was white. The fountain in his front yard had frozen mid-cascade. Their breath steamed in the freezing air. Battering ram hit the door and the sound was tremendous, splitting wood, shattering locks, the noise of power meeting resistance. FBI. Hands where we can see them. Now. Douglas Hale stumbled from his bedroom in silk pajamas the color of champagne, his expensive hair mussed, his face the color of wet newspaper. His hands went up. His mouth opened. He was 63 years old, and in that moment he looked decades older, all his corruption and cruelty and casual destruction finally catching up with him. Lead Agent Morrison, the man who had taken Luca's money for 15 years, threw documentation onto the marble floor. Bank statements. Wire transfers. Testimony. Years of evidence, meticulously gathered. Douglas Hale, you are under arrest for 40 years of fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy to bribe public officials, and 17 counts of arson. You hired someone to cut electrical wiring in for residential buildings. You burned them for insurance money. You blamed the tenants. You destroyed innocent people. Hale's voice rose to a scream. That Morgan woman started that fire. She. We have the man you paid. He gave testimony. We have documentation proving you ordered him. Every transaction. Every phone call. Every lie. Morrison's voice was ice. You will serve 40 years in federal prison. You will die there. Hale's legs gave out. He collapsed to the marble floor, trembling like a cornered animal, like a man watching his entire world burn. Tears streamed down his face as agents shackled his wrists. They dragged him out toward the federal vehicles, his silk pajamas torn, his dignity in pieces. News cameras waited outside. Luca had made sure they knew exactly where to be and exactly when. Every major outlet in the city captured the moment, the powerful landlord with political connections, the man who had operated with impunity for 40 years, led past microphones with his face grey and destroyed, his life ending not with mercy but with the slow mathematics of justice. At that same hour, 3 blocks away in her Hamptons estate, Margaret Harrington opened her front door to find Tony standing on her threshold with a briefcase. "Can I help you?" she asked, still in her dressing gown, her face a study in confusion and privilege. "Margaret Harrington, you are being served with a federal subpoena. You are being sued for defamation, slander, conspiracy to commit insurance fraud, and conspiracy to destroy evidence. Multiple victims are filing civil claims against you." Tony's voice was steady, professional, merciless. "Federal investigators seized your records 1 hour ago. Your accountant is in custody. Your attorney is being questioned." Her face went white. "That's absurd. I want my lawyer." "Your lawyer is already being questioned," Tony said. He opened the briefcase. Folders. Hundreds of documents. Recordings. Bank statements. Photographs. Email chains discussing which buildings to burn, which tenants to frame, which false accusations to spread about Aria Morgan to ensure no one would hire her. "Everything you said about her," Tony continued, "we have on tape. Every call you made to spread rumors. Every lie you orchestrated. It's all documented." News vans were already pulling up to the gates of her property. Luca had made sure of that too. By noon, Margaret Harrington's name was destroyed across every news channel in the country. The wealthy businesswoman with the prestigious reputation, the woman whose social standing had been the only thing she valued, watched it crumble like ash. Her business dissolved. Her assets seized for restitution. Her reputation, the only currency that had ever mattered to her, gone. She did not go to prison. But she lost everything else. Anonymity would be mercy. Instead, she would spend the rest of her life as a cautionary tale, a name whispered in disgust, a woman erased by her own cruelty. And Vincent Caruso was dragged into Luca's office at dawn. He entered cocky, thinking blood made him untouchable, thinking family was armor. The office was silent except for the sound of Luca's breathing, deep and solid like an oath. Tony and Theo flanked him like statues carved from stone. "You threatened someone under my protection," Luca said. His voice was not loud. It was quiet. It was the voice of a man with nothing left to prove. "That maid? Come on, uncle, I was just..." Luca moved and the world shifted. One punch. Perfect. Calculated. Vincent's nose broke with a sound like a branch snapping. Blood exploded across his expensive shirt. He crashed to the floor, screaming, holding his face, his cocky smile replaced by the raw truth of his own fragility. Luca stood over him, breathing steadily. You're out. Out of the family. Out of the business. Out of New York. You have 24 hours. If I ever see you again, if you ever speak her name again, they will find you in pieces. Vincent sobbed and crawled out of the office like a wounded animal. By evening, he was on a plane to Los Angeles, exiled, powerless, destroyed, not by death, too quick and merciful, but by the systematic dismantling of everything he thought made him untouchable. Justice had been delivered. 3 people who had believed themselves untouchable. 3 people who had thought consequence was a word that applied to other people. Now their lives were ruins. And somewhere across the city, Aria Morgan woke to her telephone ringing at 7 in the morning with a call from an FBI agent informing her that Douglas Hale had been arrested, that her case was closed, that she was safe. She stood in the shelter room holding her children, and for the first time in 3 years, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the storm was finally passing. After the rain, the sky clears. And sometimes miracles come from the most unexpected places. The morning light filtered through the shelter windows like pale gold water. Aria Morgan stood in the common room, her children still asleep on narrow cots behind her, when the television mounted on the wall flickered to life with the breakfast news. Her hand stilled on the cup of coffee she was holding. Not because of what she saw, but because of what she could not believe she was seeing. Douglas Hale, her landlord, the man with the cruel mouth and the connections to dirty cops, was being led out of a federal building in handcuffs. His expensive suit hung loose on his frame. His face had gone the color of ash. FBI agents flanked him on both sides, their dark suits identical, their expressions carved from stone. The news anchor's voice crackled across the speakers, 30 years of fraud, corruption, and extortion. Federal sentencing expected to reach 40 years. 40 years. Aria's coffee cup slipped from her fingers and shattered on the tile floor. The sound woke Mrs. Chen, the shelter director, who appeared in the doorway within seconds, moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who had seen crisis 100 times before. But this was not crisis. This was the opposite of crisis. Aria, Mrs. Chen said quietly. There's someone here to see you. The man in the lobby wore an impeccable dark suit. Tony. She recognized him from the restaurant, from those nights when he and Thea would sit in Luca's private booth, saying nothing, watching everything. His face carried no expression as he approached her, but his eyes held something like understanding. Mr. Caruso sent me, Tony said. His voice was steady, professional. He held out an envelope. The fire marshal reopened your case. New evidence emerged. You have been cleared of all charges related to the arson. All of them. Aria's vision blurred. She could not speak. Tony continued, his words precise as a hammer strike. This is a check for the full amount Hale claimed you owed, $47,000, plus compensation for your losses. And this? He handed her a second document, leather-bound, official. A 3-bedroom apartment. First year's rent is paid. After that, market rate applies. It's yours to build in. She stared at the papers in her trembling hands. The check bore Luca Caruso's signature. The apartment lease was in her name alone. I can't accept this, she whispered. Tony's expression did not change, but something shifted in his eyes. It is not charity. It is justice. There is a difference. He placed a business card on the table beside her. If you need anything, you call that number. Day or night. Mr. Caruso's word on it. He turned and walked toward the door. His footsteps echoed on the tile, measured and unhurried, the sound of a man who had delivered his message and now retreated to let her breathe. Aria looked down at the check. At the lease. At the photograph of the three-bedroom apartment with windows that actually locked and heat that actually worked. She thought of Sophie and Michael sleeping on cots that smelled like industrial soap. She thought of Sophie asking her last night if they would have to live here forever. She thought of the prayer card still in her pocket, the one she had clutched through the fire, the one her mother had pressed into her palm on the day she married someone who would break her in ways she could not yet imagine. She took the envelope. Over the next 6 months, Aria Morgan rebuilt her life with the methodical patience of someone who understood that miracles came in small pieces, not whole. She moved into the apartment on a Tuesday in November. The 3 rooms seemed like a palace. She stood in the kitchen and wept, not from sadness, but from the sheer overwhelming reality that this was hers. The walls were clean. The windows had locks. The radiator clanked to life with actual heat. Sophie and Michael each got their own bedroom. Aria hung the photograph that had survived the fire in the main room. The prayer card went beside it in a frame. She enrolled her children in a good school. She continued at the restaurant, and Paolo, the owner who had hired her when no one else would, promoted her to hostess, then assistant manager. She worked the evening shift and took community college courses in business management during the day. She saved her paychecks in a jar on the kitchen counter. Every dollar represented a choice, survival or safety. She chose both. Luca did not appear at the apartment. He did not call. He did not send flowers or messages. But there were signs of his silent presence, like the work of an invisible hand, the mechanic who fixed her car's transmission for nothing but Mr. Caruso says to take care of it. The landlord who never once mentioned raising her rent, despite the market prices climbing around him. A job offer from a 5-star restaurant in Midtown that she declined because she had chosen to stay at Paolo's place, where she had been broken open and remade. 8 months after the night she saved Emma from choking on an olive, Aria stood in Paolo's office as he handed her a message written on a card in careful script: "If you would be willing, there is someone who would like to have dinner with you. No obligation. No expectation. Simply dinner. If yes, come to the private booth on Saturday at 8. She recognized the handwriting. Not from letters, there had been none, but from the restaurant's reservation book. She had seen it 1,000 times. She said yes. The private booth gleamed with candlelight. The white tablecloth was spotless. Outside the window, frost coated the glass like crushed diamonds, and stars burned in the black sky with the kind of clarity that only came on the coldest nights. The air smelled of wine and rosemary and something deeper, something she could not name. Luca Caruso sat across from her in a dark suit, a silver ring catching the candlelight on his left hand. He looked at her directly, and she saw something in his eyes that she had never seen before, not the Mafia boss, not the feared man who had orchestrated the destruction of 2 people who tried to destroy her, but a man who was still learning how to be more than what he had been forced to become. "I have been thinking about something," he said. His voice was deep and solid like an oath. "The night you saved Emma, you asked me why I would help you. Do you remember?" Aria nodded. She could not speak. "You said you were nobody," he continued. "You were wrong. When my father was murdered, I was 17. I watched it happen. I built everything you see on vengeance. On fear. On making sure that no one could ever hurt me again. I became violent because violence was the only language I understood." He paused. His hand moved across the table, stopping just short of touching hers. "But you showed me something else. You asked for nothing. You gave everything. You saved my daughter without knowing who I was, and then you asked nothing of me." "I didn't save her for a reward," Aria said quietly. "I know. That is precisely why it changed everything." His voice cracked slightly, almost imperceptibly. Tony and Theo, if they had been there, would have recognized this moment for what it was: unprecedented. In 15 years, they had never heard him speak like this. "You saved more than Emma that night. You saved me from becoming only the darkness I inherited." Aria reached across the table. She took his hand. His skin was warm, his grip gentle, nothing like what she had expected from a man built from stone and shadow. The food arrived untouched and was cleared away untouched. They sat in the candlelight, hands linked, speaking about their children, about the restaurants he was legitimizing, about the business degree she was pursuing. Hours compressed into moments. The night deepened outside the frosted windows, and neither of them moved. When they finally left the restaurant, Luca walked her to her car. He did not kiss her. He simply stood beside her in the cold, his breath visible in the winter air, and said, "I would like to do this again. If you would allow it." "Yes," she said. 1 year later, Aria Morgan stood in her apartment, no longer a charity case but a woman who paid her own rent from money she had earned, helping Sophie with mathematics homework while Michael set the table for dinner. The photograph of her children, miraculously saved from the fire, sat on the mantel in a new frame. The prayer card was beside it. There was a knock. She opened the door to find Luca and Emma, who immediately ran to embrace her. Luca carried flowers, not extravagant, simply beautiful, and a bottle of wine. The four of them ate pasta that Aria had made herself, and somewhere in the middle of that ordinary, miraculous meal, Aria realized that she was no longer afraid. Not of the future. Not of loss. Not of the man across the table from her, who looked at her with eyes that held no darkness anymore, only recognition. Later, after Emma and the children were playing in the other room, Aria and Luca stood by the window looking out at the city. The lights of New York stretched endlessly before them, the same city that had tried to destroy her, the same city that had made him a god of vengeance. "I could not have done any of this without you," she said. Luca turned to face her. "Yes, you could have. You simply did not have to." She leaned her head against his shoulder. His arm came around her, solid and real and present in a way that made her understand that some people spend their entire lives searching for this, not rescue, but recognition. Not salvation, but someone who sees you clearly and stays anyway. Outside, snow began to fall, silent and gentle, covering the city in white. After the rain, the sky clears. And sometimes miracles come from the most unexpected places. They come from a poor widow who asks nothing and gives everything. They come from a man who learned that mercy is not weakness. They come from the moment when two broken people choose to rebuild not alone, but together. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Drop a comment below and tell us what you thought. And subscribe because tomorrow we are bringing you another story that will remind you that courage can come from anywhere, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to give up. We wish you good health, a joyful life, and days filled with peace and happiness. Thank you for staying with us until the very end. We will see you again in the next video.